The room went quiet the moment my brother-in-law walked through the door in a suit he'd never worn to a job site in his life. I remember thinking, that's a $400 jacket on a man who's never pulled a permit. That was the moment I knew. Not suspected. Knew. I'd been with Hargrove Mechanical for 19 years. I started there at 36, fresh off a failed attempt at running my own HVAC outfit in Central Ohio. My company had gone under. Not because the work was bad, but because I was terrible at collections and worse at saying no to customers who wanted everything yesterday and wanted to pay for it. Never. I had 2 kids, a mortgage in Westerville, and exactly one option left: go work for someone else and do it right this time. My wife's father, Gerald Hargrove, had built Hargrove Mechanical from a 2-van operation into a mid-sized commercial contractor covering most of central and southern Ohio. Hospitals, school districts, county buildings. The kind of work that doesn't come from a Yellow Pages ad. It comes from relationships, reputation, and the slow accumulation of trust that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Gerald offered me a job, not a handout. He was clear about that. He needed someone who understood field operations and could take some of the management weight off his plate. His son, my brother-in-law Derek, was 26 at the time and had no interest in the business. Derek was in Columbus trying to make it as a real estate investor, which mostly meant he went to networking events and drove a leased BMW. I said yes. For the first 2 years, I was a project coordinator. I learned how Gerald ran things. The vendors he trusted, the inspectors who needed extra lead time, the school district facilities managers who'd been working with him since 1987 and expected a Christmas card every year without fail. I took notes on everything, kept a binder, went home and read state procurement guidelines on my own time because I wanted to understand why we were getting certain contracts and losing others. By year 4, I was running project management for everything over $500,000. By year 9, Gerald put me in charge of business development. That title sounds fancy. What it actually meant was that I was the one who drove to Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, and everywhere in between to maintain the government relationships that fed the company. State agency contracts, county maintenance agreements, 3 hospital systems, and, starting in year 11, federal facility work, primarily through GSA schedule contracts, which required a level of compliance documentation that Gerald frankly didn't have the patience for. I built that side of the business from nothing. The first TSA contract we landed was worth $240,000. A federal courthouse in downtown Columbus needed HVAC system upgrades, and I had spent 8 months learning the procurement process, getting us registered in SAM.gov, and putting together a capability statement that actually reflected what we could do. Gerald looked at the award letter and told me I'd earned a bonus. He shook my hand in the parking lot and said, "I don't know how you did that, but don't stop." I didn't stop. By my 15th year, federal work accounted for roughly 30% of our annual revenue. We had 4 active GSA schedule contracts. I knew the contracting officers at 4 different federal agencies by first name. 2 of them had my cell number and called me directly when urgent work came up. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who managed facilities procurement for a regional VA hospital, had told me once, "You're the only contractor who actually reads the statement of work before you call me." I laughed. She wasn't joking. My wife, Claire, knew how much I'd put into the business. She'd watched me miss dinners and weekend soccer games to drive to a pre-bid meeting 3 hours away. She'd listened to me talk through compliance issues at 10 at night when she was trying to unwind. She never complained. Not once. She understood what we were building. Not just for her father's company, but for our family. We had profit sharing. We had health benefits. We had the quiet confidence of knowing that if I kept doing what I was doing, there would be something to show for it. What Claire also knew, better than I did, was her family. She'd warned me about Derek before we were even married. Not in a dramatic way, just offhand, the way you'd mention that a particular intersection is always backed up. "Derek has always gotten what Derek wants," she said once. "Dad just can't say no to him." I'd filed that away and mostly forgotten it. Derek had burned through his real estate phase by the time he was 30. Then he did a stint at a tech startup that folded. Then something in marketing. Then a long period of what I can only describe as figuring things out, funded quietly by Gerald. At 38, Derek decided he wanted to be in the family business. I heard this first from Claire, who heard it from her mother. Not from Gerald. Not in a meeting. Through the family grapevine. The way you hear things that people know you won't like. I didn't panic. I told myself there was room in the business for Derek to learn the ropes. Maybe run smaller residential projects. Build up slowly the way I had. I told myself Gerald was smarter than to hand the federal side to someone who'd never filled out a subcontractor agreement. I told myself that for about 8 months. The Monday it happened. We had a staff meeting at 9 a.m. Nothing unusual. Gerald held them monthly, went over project status, financials, upcoming bids. I had a presentation ready on a VA contract renewal we were competing for, a significant one, worth about $800,000 over 3 years. I walked in, and Derek was already sitting at the head of the conference table, Gerald's chair. I sat down. I looked at Derek's jacket. I looked at the folder in front of him, which I could see had a company letterhead on the top sheet. I looked at Gerald, who was standing near the window with his coffee and not making eye contact with me. Gerald waited for the room to settle. 8 of us total. The project managers, the office manager, Derek, me. Then Gerald said that he'd been thinking about the future of the company, about succession, about making sure Hargrove Mechanical stayed in the family for the next generation. He said he was proud of everything we built together. He said he was going to be stepping back from day-to-day operations, and he said that Derek would be taking over as general manager, effective immediately, with responsibility for business development and client relationships. My job, my title, my relationships, handed to a man who had never once attended a federal pre-bid meeting. The room was very still. I didn't say anything. I looked at Gerald, and Gerald looked out the window, and that told me everything I needed to know about how much warning I was going to get. Derek gave a short speech. Something about being excited to bring fresh energy. Something about evolving with the market. I stopped listening somewhere in the middle of it. After the meeting, I walked back to my office, sat down, and stared at the surface of my desk for about 4 minutes. Then I opened my laptop and started making a list. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I don't want it to sound like I had some master plan sitting in a drawer. I didn't. What I had was 19 years of careful work, and one very specific fact that I don't think Gerald had ever fully thought through. Every GSA schedule contract we held, all 4 of them, listed me as the authorized negotiator and contract administrator. Not Hargrove Mechanical. Me, personally, by name and credentials. This had happened for a practical reason. When I originally registered us in the federal procurement systems, I'd used my own professional background and certifications as the qualifying individual. It was the cleanest way to meet the experience requirements. Gerald had signed off on it years ago without really understanding the implications. Why would he? Federal contracting paperwork is dense, and he trusted me to handle it. What it meant, practically, was that when the government needed to communicate with Hargrove Mechanical on those contracts, they communicated with me. When modifications came through, I signed them. When past performance records were updated, they reflected my name. When new task orders came in, the contracting officers called my cell phone. It also meant that those contracts were not automatically transferable if I left. I called a federal contracting attorney that afternoon. Not to start a fight, just to understand exactly where I stood. He walked me through it calmly. The government relationships were built on my credentials and my past performance record. A new authorized representative would need to be vetted. Existing task orders could be affected. The upcoming VA renewal, given its timeline, would be particularly complicated if there was a sudden change in the contract administrator. "What are you thinking about doing?" he asked. "Leaving," I said. "Then I'd suggest you not burn anything. Just walk out with what's yours." I gave Gerald 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. He didn't argue. He looked surprised, and then he looked like a man who had just realized he'd made an irreversible mistake but wasn't going to admit it. He said he hoped we could keep things professional. I said, of course. I didn't tell him about the contracts. I didn't need to. What I did was spend those 2 weeks making sure everything that had my name on it was accounted for. My contacts, organized and saved in my own files. My correspondence with contracting officers, archived. My continuing education credentials and certifications, all mine, all current, all paid for partially out of my own pocket over the years because I'd cared enough to stay current. I also called Patricia at the VA. I told her I was leaving Hargrove and starting my own consulting and contracting firm. I told her I wanted to make sure there was no disruption to the ongoing work. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Well, are you going to be registering under your own entity?" I told her I was. She said, Then I imagine we'll be talking soon. The first 90 days after I left were the hardest I'd had since my original company folded. I was running everything out of a spare bedroom, on a laptop and a cell phone, with a business bank account I'd opened the week before my notice. My wife had gone back to work full-time. Her choice, not something I asked for, but she made it before I even finished explaining the situation. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "What do you need from me?" "Not. Are you sure?" "Not. What about Dad?" "Just, what do you need?" I needed 90 days of runway and someone who believed I knew what I was doing. She gave me both. By the end of month 3, I had 2 active federal task orders under my own entity. 1, a continuation of work I'd built the relationship for. 1, a new opportunity Patricia had flagged for me directly. I'd also picked up 2 of the county relationships I'd cultivated over the years. Those contracts weren't exclusive to Hargrove, and the facilities managers knew who'd actually been doing the work. By month 6, I had a part-time project coordinator on payroll and a subcontractor I'd worked with for years who was willing to bet on me the same way I was betting on myself. I heard through a mutual contact, not Claire, she'd removed herself from that particular information loop, that Hargrove Mechanical had lost the VA contract renewal. Derek had apparently called Patricia's office to introduce himself and fumbled the conversation badly enough that she'd asked to speak to whoever handled this before. There was nobody left who could answer that question. I also heard that the GSA schedule contracts had fallen into a compliance gap during the transition. Getting them reinstated would require essentially starting the registration process over, which takes months and requires documentation that Derek had no way to produce. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. What I felt was the particular quiet of a man who had done the work, built the thing, and simply taken it with him when he left. There's a moment in the months after that I keep coming back to. I was at a federal facility pre-bid walkthrough in Dayton. One of those cold Tuesday mornings in February when the parking lot is half frozen and everyone is standing around with bad coffee waiting for the contracting officer to arrive. A contractor I recognized from the old days came over and shook my hand. He'd heard I'd gone out on my own. "Brave move," he said. I thought about that word for a second. Brave. "Nah," I told him. "I just knew what I was carrying." He laughed, and we talked about the project, and that was that. But I meant it. It wasn't bravery. Bravery implies you don't know whether it's going to work. I knew what I'd built. I knew whose phone numbers were in my contacts and who they'd been calling for the last decade. I knew my past performance record and what it said about the quality of work I delivered. I wasn't taking a gamble. I was picking up what was mine. Gerald called me about 8 months after I left. Not angry. The moment for anger had apparently passed. He sounded tired. He asked how things were going, and I told him honestly. Well, better than expected. He said he'd made some mistakes. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask him to. I told him I bore no hard feelings toward him personally. That was also honest. Gerald was a man who built something real and then couldn't see clearly when his son was involved. It's a common failure. I understood it even if I couldn't excuse it. I didn't ask about Derek. I didn't need to know. Claire was in the kitchen when I got off the phone. She looked up from what she was reading, and I said, "Your dad called." She nodded once. She said, "How is he?" "Older," I said. She nodded again and went back to her book. We didn't discuss it further. Some things don't need a post-mortem. I've thought a lot about what the last few years have taught me, and I'll tell you the things I actually believe, not the polished version. The first thing is this: know exactly what you own. Not in an abstract sense. I mean specifically, in any professional situation, understand which relationships are yours, which credentials are yours, which institutional knowledge lives in your head and nowhere else. Most people don't think about this until it's too late. I got lucky that the structure of federal contracting made it concrete and legally meaningful. But the principle applies everywhere. The second thing is that loyalty given to a business is not the same as loyalty returned by one. A business is not a person. The owner is a person, and people have blind spots, and one of the most reliable blind spots a person can have is their own family. I gave 19 years to Hargrove Mechanical, and I have no regrets about a single day of that work because I was building real skills and real relationships and real credentials the entire time. The company just happened to be the vehicle. When the vehicle changed direction, I had everything I needed to keep going on my own. The third thing, and this is the one I think about most, is that the best outcome for me didn't require anyone else to fail. I didn't make calls to undermine Hargrove. I didn't do anything to pull the contracts other than simply be the person who had built them and leave. What happened to their federal pipeline was a consequence of their own decision, not a result of anything I engineered. I think about the dog sled analogy sometimes. I heard a version of it years ago, and it stuck. When you're working for a family company and you're not family, you're a dog on the sled team. The view never changes, and you'll never ride the sled. Most people who hear that analogy use it as a reason not to work hard. I think they're missing the point. Work hard anyway. Build the skills. Build the relationships. Just do it knowing they belong to you, not to the sled, because the day comes. For a lot of people, it comes when the sled changes course. And if you've been paying attention, you already know where you're going next. My firm is small. I have no interest in building a large operation. 4 people, a tight roster of subcontractors I trust, and a client list that would have taken me 20 years to build if I'd started cold. I didn't start cold. I started with 2 decades of relationships and a reputation that nobody gave me. I built it meeting by meeting, contract by contract, Tuesday morning pre-bid walkthrough by Tuesday morning pre-bid walkthrough. My youngest daughter asked me recently what I do for work. She's 12. I told her I help the government fix things in buildings. She said, "Is it boring?" I thought about Patricia calling me directly when something urgent came up. I thought about the contracting officer in Dayton who told me last fall that I was the most prepared vendor she'd ever worked with. I thought about the Tuesday I walked into that conference room and watched everything I'd built get handed to a man in a borrowed suit. "Not anymore," I told her. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her homework. I poured a cup of coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard we'd almost lost when I was scrambling in those first 90 days. The oak tree my son used to climb, the fence I need to repaint before summer. 19 years is a long time, but it turns out it was just enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, and the thing I keep coming back to is this. None of it was an accident. Not the good parts, and not the painful parts either. When Gerald stood up in that conference room and handed my title to Derek, he wasn't just making a business decision. He was revealing something that had always been true. That in his mind, the company was first and always a family asset. And I was, at the end of the day, staff. Useful staff. Valuable staff. But staff. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because I think it's important to see people clearly, and seeing Gerald clearly helped me understand something about myself that I'd been avoiding for years. I had been building something I thought was shared. It wasn't. And the reason I hadn't noticed sooner is that I'd confused loyalty with ownership. I was loyal to the work. I was loyal to the relationships. I was loyal to Gerald's vision of what the company could be. But none of that loyalty gave me a seat at the table when the real decisions were made. The seat at the table had Derek's name on it the whole time. I just couldn't see it from where I was standing. What I did have, and what nobody could hand to someone else, was 19 years of showing up and doing the work correctly. Every contracting officer who had my cell number had it because I'd earned it. Every past performance record that reflected well had my name on it because I delivered on what I promised. Patricia didn't call me after I left because she felt sorry for me. She called me because I was the person who read the statement of work before picking up the phone. That's not a gift. That's a choice, made over and over again for almost 2 decades. I think about Derek sometimes, not with anger, just with a kind of clarity. He walked into that conference room in a suit he couldn't fill and accepted a role he hadn't earned, and the company paid the price for that long before he understood what he'd inherited. That's not a punishment from some outside force. That's just consequence. When you place someone in a position that requires knowledge they don't have and relationships they haven't built, the gap shows up eventually. It showed up for Derek in a phone call with Patricia that he wasn't prepared to make. The 3 things I'd want anyone to take from what I lived through are simple, and I mean them in the most practical sense possible. The first is integrity in the work itself, not integrity as an abstract value, but as a daily practice. Do the thing correctly even when nobody is checking. Learn the process even when it's tedious. Return the call even when the timing is inconvenient. Over time, that becomes a record, and a record is something you carry with you when you walk out the door. The second is intelligence about what you actually own. I don't mean legal ownership in every case. I mean understanding which parts of your professional life are transferable and which parts belong specifically to you. Your reputation, your relationships, your credentials, your judgment. Those don't live on a company server. They live in you. The third is the stubbornness, and I do mean stubbornness, to keep going through the 90 days that feel impossible. Claire went back to work without being asked. I worked out of a spare bedroom and kept going. That's not heroism. That's just refusing to let a hard moment become the final chapter. What Gerald gave his son was a title. What I took with me was everything that made it worth having.